Hi, this is Andrew Collin with Critical Path Training, and I'd like to now introduce you to Sandbox Solutions, a new thing that we have inside SharePoint 2010. Before we really dive into this, let's take a look at what we had in the previous version of SharePoint and why these things came about. History is always a good lesson here. So the way things worked in the last version of SharePoint is that developers would go through and build custom solutions, and they would then test and build and make sure all this stuff looked good, and then hand them over to administrators. Administrators would then take these custom solutions, they deploy them into the SharePoint farm, and then they add them to the farm, and then they go through and deploy them across the farm. And then finally, the site collection administrators or the users would then be able to add whatever components were in those solutions. They would be able to add and leverage them within the site, such as web parts, workflows, or whatever. Now, the challenge with this is that administrators didn't really have a whole lot of control over being able to wrap their arms around the stuff that developers were building. There was no way to really kind of say that you could or couldn't do certain things without inspecting every single package that came across here. The other problem that we had is that site collection owners always had to go to an administrator to get something deployed in production, which may slow things down quite a bit for some sort of a review cycle. So, and the third thing is, that's really the big reason for this, is that the number one issue or the number one root cause for SharePoint problems in the 2007 version of SharePoint was custom code, stuff that we wrote as developers that simply caused problems inside of SharePoint. It was the number one issue that we had. So what Microsoft did is they then came up with this concept called the Sandbox Solutions. Now what these are just taking, it's very much the same thing where developers still build solutions, but now they don't have to go to administrators to deploy those solutions. Now they can give the solution straight to the site collection administrator, who can then add the solution to the solution gallery, a special gallery that we have inside SharePoint. And then once it's activated, they can then use that solution inside their site. It can contain things like web parts or features or workflow, a lot of different things we can have inside of SharePoint. Now the nice thing here is that we're able to bypass the administrators and get stuff into SharePoint much faster. But the nice thing that administrators have now is a way to go through, and they have this sandbox to lock stuff down so that certain things can't, that developers first of all can't do certain things that are a little dangerous, but then also that these things that are running inside the sandbox, they're going to be monitored and they're going to accumulate points, and you only have so many points per day that you can leverage or that you can use. If you use too many points, then all your custom solutions in the sandbox are going to get shut down, right, for the rest of the day until the counters get reset here. This is giving this is really the best of both worlds, because now we as developers can get stuff into SharePoint much faster. Our code is also going to be protected by the server, and so we're basically having a nice little fail-safe to make sure that we're not harming the server. But then the other thing that's nice about it is that site collection owners are able to get new things into SharePoint without having to go to IT pros. But best of all, the IT pros don't have to worry about solutions that are already out there, because if there's a poor performing solution, it'll shut itself down, or SharePoint will shut it down. And you'll be able to monitor these things and be able to let site collection owners know, hey, you've got some poor performing stuff out here that you need to address. All right. So we have these sandbox solutions. Now what they're going to do is, first of all, they're going to allow us to do only a subset of the full set of solution stuff that we could do for like what we now call as a farm solution, or a solution that can be fully trusted. And that's one that you would do the traditional add it to the solution store and then deploy them, and to put all the code out there that you have to do through central administration or through the command line with PowerShell. We can't do everything, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. All the code is going to run within the sandbox, and so if something faults, it's not going to bring down the entire environment. It's going to be very isolated, and it's also going to be monitored so that a certain number of faults will cause it to completely shut down. I mentioned that these things will be deployed by the site collection administrator, and that they'll also be deployed to something called the solution gallery that sits at the same level with the web part gallery, the master page gallery, and all of that inside of SharePoint here. So a lot of the stuff is I've already touched on here, where it's going to empower site collection owners to deploy new functionality without burdening the IT pros or really burdening themselves and having to wait for IT pros to review stuff and get it deployed and tested. Things are going to be a lot more secure because the site collection owner is going to be in full control. They can go through and turn off the ones that are poor performing. They can see which ones are poor performing. Things are just going to be in a much better shape. But the nice thing too, like we said a minute ago, was that the IT pros have full control over monitoring these things and giving either either giving more points to certain groups or taking points away from other groups. So it's very powerful. These Sandbox solutions are going to help enterprises here for a multitude of reasons here. First of all, hosted SharePoint solutions now, or SharePoint deployments, are much more possible because now we can easily deploy custom code in a hosted environment and just make sure that we're not taxing the server too much. If we are, well, then we have to pay for it, right? That's one thing. It's also going to reduce the time to get custom solutions deployed up into SharePoint, and best of all, it's going to really improve the stability of our SharePoint boxes because now they're not going to be beat up so much or be burdened by poor performing code. They're going to be able to do the self-healing and block the poor performing code from really doing a whole lot of damage to themselves. Okay, so let's look at a little bit of an overview of what the Sandbox here is here. He's going to provide a subset of the full capabilities to the SharePoint API. He's also very secure because all the code is going to run in a partially trusted environment. It's all wrapped up in its own CAS policy that the Sandbox has. All of the code is also going to run in a special process, and you'll see later where that process can actually be pulled off of the web front ends and put on app servers that are responsible for running that stuff. There's a nice validation framework which we'll touch on in another session, which allows me to do maybe some custom validation checking to see if a solution should be or should not be allowed in my farm. All right? And then finally, all the solutions are going to be completely isolated to one site collection. So if I take a solution, deploy it to one site collection, deploy it to another site collection, they're not seen as the same solution. Okay? So a couple different things there. So what's the life cycle of a Sandbox solution look like? Well, you're first going to install it, and that's essentially taking the WSP and putting it into the solution gallery. You're then going to have to activate this guy, and when you activate the solution, that's going to automatically activate any features that are inside of it, and that's going to just be the process of the same kind of process we have today of like with a feature. Once it's activated, then we can use its functionality. The deactivation, what that's going to do is basically any of the web parts that are out there, that's just going to basically keep them from running anymore. They're just not going to be available anymore. And that's going to be, that's what's going to happen with solutions that are using up too many resources. And that's also going to be a way for the site collection owner to disable something that's not running well. And then finally, I could go through and delete these guys and pull them out of the environment altogether. This is just a sample list here of things that we can do inside the Sandbox. So we can create web parts and list templates and workflows and event receivers, a lot of the common stuff that we normally want to do as developers in building custom stuff inside of SharePoint. So let's take a look here at a little demo and just see how we can go through and install and run something inside the Sandbox. And let's see how easy this really is. So in this demo, I want to show you just how we would work with the Sandbox and then how we would also go through and see what the experience is like for a bad solution. So first, what I'm going to do is just go and show you what the experience would be to go through and add a new project here. So I'm going to add a new project. Now when I go to add a new project, I'm going to pick SharePoint 2010, and we'll just pick a let's see, .NET 3.5, sort of ascending, and we'll just do we'll just do an event receiver real quick. So I'll say OK, and now the first thing that SharePoint's going to ask me is, first of all, what site do you want to use for debugging, but more importantly, what do I want to use here? Do I want to make this a Sandbox solution, which is the default, which is what everyone really should try to do, is create Sandbox solutions, or do you want it to be a farm solution? So what is this little checkbox thing, or is this little radio button really doing here? Well, if I cancel out of this and take a look at one of the ones that we already have, that I've already created here, called the sample Sandbox web part, you can see here these listed as a Sandbox solution. Now, all this is really doing for me is this is just going in, and I've got this web part that I created here. All it's doing is it's just kind of controlling the IntelliSense for me to kind of say what things are available to me. So you'll see that, first of all, if I go back to the project here, and let's just switch this over to false. And if I go through and we'll open the web part back up here. Now, one of the things that I'm used to being able to do is going and looking at the SP security and having the ability to go through and call run with elevated privileges. That's not allowed in the Sandbox, though. I'm not allowed to do that kind of thing because that's a really dangerous thing to do. So you can see that I'm allowed to do it because remember, I said this is not a Sandbox solution, right? But if I go back and turn that field on, change him to true, he now is a Sandbox solution, you will see that I can go through and say, SP, let's go find security, It's not there. SP security is not available to me. That's just controlling the IntelliSense. Now, the one trick that people may find here is that when I'm copying code from somebody else's solution, or I'm opening up an existing solution and testing it, you may find this one little thing that may catch you off guard here. Even though it's not an IntelliSense, I can go through and type in security dot run with elevated privileges. And you're thinking, well, now wait a minute. How can I do this inside of the sandbox if I'm not really allowed to do this? We'll come to that in just a little bit. We'll come to that in another demo. So here's just a simple sandbox solution web part that's going through and creating a label and then pitching it into the controls collection here. So what I'm going to do, I've already got this guy created, so I'm going to go over to my site, contosoinc.com. I'm going to come over here into the site settings for my site and look underneath the gallery section and click on solutions. That's the solution gallery. And I'm going to go through and upload a new solution here. So I'm going to upload a solution, and I'm going to go find my sample solution here. And now it's going to ask me, do I want to go ahead and activate this guy? I'll say, yeah, sure, let's go ahead and activate him. Now what that meant, what the activation meant, that meant that it's now available to me. So I can now go to another page on my site. We'll go to default.aspx, switch him over into edit mode. Let's get rid of this web part. And let's add in our sandbox sample web part here. This guy doesn't do anything fancy. He just spits out the current day and time. Something that we're very allowed to do. We're allowed to go through and put controls into the controls collection and then go through and render them out. Now what is happening here, we'll talk about how the processing is happening and how things are loading in just a few minutes. So here's where you see the date and time listed out for my sandbox web part. Remember, he's running inside the sandbox, which is great. So the next question is, well, what happens if I have a bad web part trying to do something I'm not allowed to do? I have another web part that we have. Close this solution here. And I'm going to open up the bad sandbox web part. Now the bad sandbox web part is doing something I'm not allowed to do here. He's going through and doing the SP security run with elevated privileges. So this guy, I've already gone through and I've already deployed him into SharePoint. Notice he's not activated. Now SharePoint is not going to stop me from activating him right now. I can still go through and activate this guy just fine because SharePoint's not doing any kind of a check here to see if he's a good or a bad web part. If I then go back to the page that we were on a second ago and I want to say I want to add a web part, I'll find my bad web part. I'll find my bad web part. Here's my bad sandbox web part right here. Took a second, but I found it. Click on add, and now what you're going to see is the sandbox is going to throw an error here. And it's basically going to say that the user code wrappers execute message on the partial trup domain, basically telling me right here that this code to run an elevated privilege is not letting me do this stuff. Now, the reason why you're getting this error here is because run with elevated privileges was blocked. It was blocked by the user code service, otherwise known as the sandbox. All right, so you'll see that this guy he's been blocked here. This user code service that's running right now, this is what's going through and controlling and making sure that stuff is allowed to run, and saying that it's running through the sandbox and making sure that everything is okay. So you can see that it blocked me from doing this, right? He threw an exception here. Now that's going to be allocated a certain number of points here. So if I go back and refresh this page, and after a little while, we'll see my points are going to actually start accumulating here. They're not processed right live. They're going to be processed a little bit delayed here. So that's the difference of how we can go through and interact with web parts inside our sandbox solutions, how we add them to the solution gallery, and then how we can still activate them and then try and leverage them, what a good one looks like and what a bad one looks like.